there, Booktube. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I wanted to discuss my experience judging the quarterfinals round of the Booktube prize. I was a judge for the nonfiction category and I was assigned to Group C. I had 6 books to read and they were all pretty heavy subjects. So it took me a long time to read. I didn't stop reading until almost the last day. And at the end of this video where I discuss how I rank the books, I want to react to the results. So I hope you'll stick around for my reaction at the end. But for now, I'm just going to go through the 6 books that I read and how I ranked them. The first book that I read was Maybe You Should Talk to Someone by Lori Gottlieb. She is a therapist, and this book was framed as a memoir, but it's more of her discussing her experience both as a therapist and the clients that she sees and some of the issues that they had and how she advised them through it, but also how she had to seek therapy herself and her experience in therapy, how she had some epiphany moments where she realized that she exhibited a lot of the same behaviors that her own clients did. There was a little bit of navel gazing, which often happens with memoirs. There was a lot of her going through her own issues. One of the primary issues that she deals with in the book is that as a single mother, she'd had a son, and she had recently, at the point of writing, she had recently terminated a relationship that she thought was going to lead to marriage because her partner said that he no longer felt, or he didn't feel like he wanted to live in a house with a child for much longer, and she felt betrayed by this change in their relationship. And a part of the reason why she sought therapy was just how to deal with the disappointment in her life. But even as she is discussing that disappointment, her therapist is kind of helping her to dig a little deeper and think about why she missed the red flags about the relationship and what she's really angry about. Is she really angry about this person leaving her life, or about other things? Maybe that the loss of the relationship is exposing. So there was some navel gazing with this book, but it was also pretty interesting to read. I learned some things about therapy that I don't think I have ever heard before, and I am really interested in psychology as a subject. So this was really interesting read for me, and it was the first book that I read for the prize. The reason that I didn't rank this book higher was just because I didn't feel like it was the book that would ultimately go on to win the Booktube prize nonfiction category, so I didn't rank it very high. I'll give you my ranking at the end. The next book that I read to judge was Underland by Robert Macfarlane. This is nature writing, and Robert Macfarlane is known for being a really skilled nature writer. In this one, he talks about trees and the links between trees, how trees are not just linked by their foliage. You might see sometimes trees that are growing pretty close together. Their leaves seem, or not just their leaves, but their leaf systems or their limbs sometimes seem like they grow interlocked. And he talked not just about how trees are linked above ground, but also how their root systems are linked underground. And what of trees, how they communicate with each other, what of how trees relate to each other we can learn from, and what do these systems tell us about life. In the book, he also spent a lot of time just talking about underground and underground systems, not just with trees and their root systems, but he also talked about rock systems, rock formations. He talks about free diving, which is, if you're not familiar, because this is fascinating to me. A few years ago, I had a friend who fell in love with the idea of free diving, and I spent a lot of time watching free diving videos, so I'm always interested to see how people talk about it in literature. And in this book, Robert Macfarlane talks about free diving, which I didn't explain. Free diving is people who do almost scuba dives, but they do it without using external breathing apparatus. So a free diver would be a person who is able to dive pretty extensive depths on a single breath of air. And so free divers, part of their training is how they can maximize their lung capacity. It was fascinating to read Robert Macfarlane talk about freediving as he talked about the underland, the underground life. I enjoyed a lot of what this book presented. The reason I didn't rank this book higher was just because there were some points where there were points in the book that weren't as greatly executed as others. So I was a little conflicted with how much I enjoyed the book in some places versus other places that felt a little uncomfortable to read. Other people who have read this book have expressed that reading about these underground facilities evoked claustrophobic tendencies. That was not my experience, but I would advise anyone who's going to this book that this might be a little bit of a trigger if you suffer from claustrophobia, reading about some of these underground features and formations and the author's experience going through those formations as well, because there were several places where he talked about going to crevices and people trying to explore crevices and getting stuck, people who died in rock formations and so on. So I enjoyed parts of this book more than I enjoyed other parts, and so ultimately I didn't give this a very high rating just because I didn't think that this was the book that would win the prize as well. The next book that I read was Parkland by Dave Cullen. Dave Cullen is a journalist, and at some point in his past he had written about the Columbine school shooting. In this more recent book, he investigated the Parkland school shooting, which happened in 2018, and he did a little bit of a comparison between the Parkland students and other students from other schools where there have been mass shootings in the past decade or so, in that the students from Parkland, they didn't just become victims or survivors, but they used the attention that was surrounding them to become lobbyists and to become activists, so that they could use their platform to institute change in the systems that exist in the United States that have allowed mass shootings to happen. And so in this book, he talked about how these students accepted the mantle and just worked towards trying to get change in their society to prevent another school shooting from happening. So I ultimately gave this one a pretty high rating because for a story that Cullen himself was not involved in, I thought he really did a thorough exploration of the subject of mass shootings, but kept it pretty specific to what happened in Parkland, using other episodes, other events as comparison, but sticking to what was being discussed and giving us a very in-depth look at the experiences of the students that were involved. So I gave this a pretty high rating. Next, I read How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. The author is an African-American male, and so a big part of the book, as he's talking about racism, he's talking from his own experience, not just as he experienced racism as a victim, but the idea that people of all ilks could be racist in their thoughts, because you can have thoughts that support negative views of another racial group. Did I say all of that right? In the book, X. Kendi talks about how we can be racist just because we have these negative stereotypes of racial groups, and we use these lenses to see people from that group and expect them to behave a certain way. And so while the author discussed racism as it's been experienced by the African American community in this country, he also talks about how racism is a much broader picture, and it can be experienced by any racial group, and it can be doled out by someone from any race. And so I thought that he did a really thorough job of exploring racism from all different perspectives, even though of course most of the focus was on how African Americans experience race in this country. So ultimately I gave this a pretty high rank because I thought that the author did a really thorough job of not just exploring it as a concept, but also framing his discussion through his own life and incorporating the change of his own perspective as he is growing. And so we're seeing him growing through the book as a person in his own personal identity, but also growing in his understanding of racism, and also as he is going through these different moments, these different transitions in his life, he is also sharing the lessons so that other people who are reading, can become not just against racism, he says, but how to be anti-racist. And so I thought that that was a really well executed study on the subject, and I gave this a high ranking. Next, I read Solitaire by Albert Woodfox, and this was another African-American male who was incarcerated in the United States for over 4 decades. He spent a long time, several decades, in solitary confinement in one of the most notoriously bad prison systems in the United States, and that's the Angola prison in New Orleans. And no, is it in New Orleans? It's in Louisiana. Throughout the book, and it's over 400 pages of his memoir where he shares his experience, talking about his early life and some of the lack of opportunities that he and others around him suffered, and that kind of propelled him into a life of petty crimes, and how eventually his petty crimes landed him in jail for a really long time, and how the prosecutors pinned a lot of charges on him because they wanted to clean the books. They wanted to just mark crimes as solved, and so they charged him with crimes that he didn't commit, and so he languished in jail for a really long time. I thought that this was such a really profound story. I thought that this was a really impactful read. Ultimately, I didn't rank this higher just because I felt like the book went on and on. There were places where what the author was saying, what he was sharing, became repetitive, and so ultimately I felt like the execution was not as strong as it could have been, just because it wasn't as tightly edited as it probably could have been. So while I thought that this was a really profound read, it fell in the ranking for me just a little bit. Next, I read Charged by Emily Bazelon, which was again about mass incarceration in the United States, but this one was a journalistic effort, and so it presented 2 case studies and gave us an opportunity to compare 2 people's experiences going through the jail system in the United States. And so one of the case studies was a young African-American male in Brooklyn, New York, who was jailed for a nonviolent crime and was able to benefit from one of the social programs that existed to try to keep young people out of jail and give them another chance to try to do something better with their life, and hopefully to keep them out of jail in the future. The next case study was a young woman who was jailed for, well, allegedly murdering her mother by stabbing, and so because of where this young woman lived, there were no such programs, and so she didn't have that opportunity. So I thought that this was a really interesting look at the prison system in the United States. Emily Bazelon went into a lot of detail discussing how kids can sometimes fall through the cracks, some of the systems that have existed that would trap young offenders and keep them in jail for a really long time. And so I thought that this was a really interesting look at a system that is frequently talked about, but I thought that she did a really good job of exploring and investigating what had happened. So I ultimately gave that a high rating as well. So those are the 6 books that I had to read, and when it came time to rank, I was a little conflicted because I had learned something interesting and thought that each one of these books was very profound in its own way. But ultimately, my number 1 book was How to Be Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. My number 2 book was Parkland by Dave Cullen, and my number 3 book was Charged by Emily Bazelon. Solitaire by Albert Woodfox, I ranked number 4, although I wasn't sure that I wanted that to be number 4. I wasn't quite sure, even up to the point where I submitted my ballot, whether I wanted that to be number 3 or number 4. But ultimately, it was my number 4 book. My number 5 book was Underland, and my number 6 book was the therapist memoir, Maybe You Should Talk to Someone. So those are the 6 books that I read and my ranking. Now to my reaction to the results, because Robert has posted the results and I was very disappointed to see that my number 1, 2, and 3 books were all disqualified. None of those 3 books have made it to the semifinals. And so the 3 books that I ranked the lowest are the 3 books that are moving on to the semifinals round. I was, like I said, very disappointed to see those results, not because I didn't like the books. I'm happy that these 3 books have moved on, because it means that other people love these books and rank them higher than I did. What made me feel just a little bit disenchanted was the idea that I read these books and voted on them, and that it's almost as if my votes didn't count because they didn't move on to the next round. But that's the luck of the draw. I don't know how many judges were in this round. I don't know. I guess maybe all the other judges love the 3 books that I ranked lowest, and so that's just what happens. So I'm not going to be judging the next round just because there are enough judges for the semifinals round, and so I'm going to be taking a break probably from judging for the next round, and so it frees me up in June to read other things. So you'll be hearing from me about other books in June. One of those things that you'll be hearing me talk about in June will be Read Caribbean. I'll be hosting the hashtag Caribathon Readathon here on the channel, so I hope you look out for that. I hope that you like this video. Give me a thumbs up if you did. Subscribe if you want to see more. I'll link in the description box down below the playlist on the Booktube Prize YouTube channel. So if this is your first time hearing about the Booktube Prize, you can go click the playlist and see how other people who judge the Booktube Prize, how they experience the judging as well. So thanks so much for watching this video. I'd love to chat with you in the comments down below. If you've read any of these books and had other thoughts, I'd love to hear it from you as well. So let's talk down there, and until next time, happy reading. Bye.